dispatches tonight, a journey to the bottom of the ocean, looking to unravel one of the great maritime mysteries. This week, the government ordered a new inquiry into the sinking of the Derbyshire, Britain's biggest ever ship loss 15 years ago in the South China Sea. But how far will the inquiry really go? And why has it taken so very long to agree to it? In tonight's dispatch, reporter Rory McLean meets the relatives who'll never give up until they discover the truth and presents disturbing new evidence that the Derbyshire's loss and the government's response were both due to total structural failure.
It's a jinx, an absolute jinx. Wherever you go on the ship, there's cracking and noises, you know, frightening noises. Jim said he was frightened.
And it sounded like somebody crying or a baby calling out all the time. You know, this is the noise we heard all the time.
It was no good ever expecting him home on the date he said he would be. That rarely happened, so I was used to delays. It never, ever crossed my mind that he would never return.
Hove to in violent storm force 11. The last message from the vessel Derbyshire. The sea seemed to have taken the ship completely. It was the biggest loss in British maritime history and the beginning of a mystery which has haunted the crew's families ever since. Many of the crew came from Merseyside. Their close relatives still meet regularly there. It's been a source of support for Paul Lambert and Marion Bayliss since hearing the news that would change their lives.
It was just an ordinary Sunday night, and I'd taken my daughter back to college. And when I returned home, my son said, Bibby Line have rung. They say that the ship has been delayed. It won't be in Japan like Monday, the following day.
Now, my mother phoned up Bibby's 4 or 5 times that night, and in the end he said, look, we've lost contact, that's no problem. Go to bed, don't keep bothering us. Which she did. Got up the next morning, and of course, you turn the news on the television, and it suddenly hits you that the Derbyshire's being lost.
This is the last survivor of the 6 massive cargo carriers, of which the Derbyshire was one. Designed to carry bulk raw commodities like oil, coal, and iron ore, thousands of nautical miles between the continents of the world. Nearly 1/3 of a kilometre long and wider than a 6-lane motorway, these ships were at the time of their construction the biggest designed and built in Britain. The loss of one of them seemed inconceivable. Especially when that loss included British sailors. The crew of the Derbyshire had made the sea their lives, and they'd been taken from their families, who had been left behind without any explanation. Paul Lambert had a brother on the Derbyshire. He was called Peter.
He just decided he wanted to go away to sea. At the last minute, he wanted to change his mind when he went for the training. You know, he didn't want to go, but, you know, my mum said, no, if this is what you want to do, go and do it. And he did. He loved the life.
For 14 years, all the families have had are their memories.
He used to put a pair of overalls on and work. He enjoyed getting his hands dirty, and he was always very busy when they came into port and left port, of course, because he was in charge of the cargo.
Curly Bayliss was the chief officer. Jim Noblet also left behind 3 children.
Jimmy loved it from being 16 years old. He ran away to sea. He just loved the sea. There was nothing else, he loved it. After each child, he always wanted to go back. He'd say, right, I'll stay at home now, you know, got compassionate leave, and he'd be at home about a couple of months. And then the feet started itching, and I'd say, right, go back.
On the 11th of July 1980, the Derbyshire had sailed from Set Ile on the Canadian coast with a heavy load of iron ore. She then followed a route past Cape Town in South Africa, where she received stores and mail by helicopter. Working her way across the Indian Ocean, the Derbyshire passed through the Lombok Strait. On the 9th of September, the captain advised the vessel's owners he was riding out a violent storm. Then nothing. There was no distress signal. But on Merseyside, one crewman did come home, leaving the ship before the last voyage. Ronnie Cann always felt uneasy on the Derbyshire.
There was 3 of us that wanted to get off it. It cost me £282 to pay myself off. You know, I paid myself off the ship. There's a funny thing about it, you know, and you can't explain it. You can't explain it. You know, you got to be there, you know, to explain the feelings wasn't right. I don't know why, because I've been a seaman now for 50 years, and no, not that ship.
The Derbyshire, first called the Liverpool Bridge, had been built at the Haverton Hill shipyard on the River Tees, run by the Swan Hunter company. The vessel was just 4 years old when she disappeared. The government took the decision there was to be no official inquiry. Shipping Minister Lord Trefgarne said at the time, in the absence of material evidence, a formal investigation would serve no useful purpose. Some families had lost their main breadwinner, but received a maximum of £5,000 compensation from the shipping line. But one ship surveyor had a personal reason for questioning the loss. Peter Ridyard's son had been on the Derbyshire, and he had doubts a severe storm had been to blame.
I think that everybody just wants to know what happened to their loved ones. They went off on a ship which, as I say, was 100 A1 class. It should never have happened in seas, even in a typhoon.
2 years passed before a clue was found. A shipping newspaper ran an article on one of the Derbyshire's sister ships, the Tyne Bridge.
She had left Hamburg in a ballast condition, i.e. there was no cargo in the vessel, and she had proceeded out of the River Elbe into the North Sea when there was a sudden, the captain heard a violent bang noise coming from the area of the deck. He obviously sent, I think the chief officer was sent down to investigate, and he came back and reported major cracking just forward of the bridge structure. The cracking was so serious that distress signal was put out, and tugs immediately went out to the vessel, and after examination it was decided she must come back into Hamburg.
Then this ship, at the time called the Cast Kittiwake, another of the vessels, ran into trouble.
She had come in for repairs, and defects of certain fractures were found on this particular vessel, which was also one of the sister vessels of the 6 that were built at Haverton Hill. After hearing about what they found on the Tyne Bridge and now what we saw on the Cast Kittiwake, I was convinced then that there was a definite connection between that and the loss of the Derbyshire.
This never-before-seen home movie footage shows the launch of the Tyne Bridge. Peter Ridyard was to discover that there had been a design change to this vessel during construction. A change which was kept in all the succeeding ships, including the Derbyshire. It would be seen as the key to unlocking the mystery. In the first of the class, the Furness Bridge, the vessel's 2 main strengthening girders ran the full length of the ship. But in the following vessels, including the Derbyshire, these girders were stopped at a bulkhead numbered 65. The girders were then continued on the other side. Any misalignment at this point would cause the bulkhead to bend and crack as the ship's structure flexed in heavy seas.
If the vessel had snapped like that, parted in that particular area, it would have been rapid. The after section, the accommodation section, would have flooded immediately, and she would have just rolled over, turned over, and the after section and down she would have gone. The forward section would have gone parted, and the two would have just gone under.
The structural integrity of ships of the size of the Derbyshire class was already concerning the Department of Transport, which as early as 1981 had commissioned research into the ship's design. Further work pointed to large seas causing major damage, leading possibly to what was called progressive failure. Then further research on the design of the 6 Derbyshire-class ships was commissioned in 1983 by the Department of Transport from a team including Professor Geraint Price. They were not told about Peter Ridyard's findings of cracking on the Tyne Bridge and Cast Kittiwake. But even so, the team concluded that on hull design alone, the Derbyshire could have suffered from gross metal fatigue in front of the superstructure. Taken in conjunction with the cracking in the sister ships, this led to a stark conclusion in an internal Department of Transport draft report of 1985.
If Derbyshire was constructed in much the same way as the sister ships, and there is little reason to suppose that she was not, then in the severe tropical storm which occurred, major cracking possibly developed. In the case of Derbyshire, it is most likely that had cracking taken place, it is probable that it took place so rapidly and extensively that total structural failure resulted. This was followed by the capsizal of the inhabited portion of the ship.
But the final Department of Transport report, which was based on those draft conclusions, rewrote them, effectively dismissing structural failure. This report, which was also an internal department document, came out the following March.
The fact that no distress signals were received might be thought to support the explanation that massive structural failure was the cause of the loss of Derbyshire. The circumstantial evidence which is described in this report also tends to point in this direction, but in the department's view is not itself conclusive.
Why did the draft report change so drastically by the time it had come to the stage of its final report? Has the government got something to hide? Is it not making all the information public? Why can't we have access to all these facts and all this information? And why isn't the government taking on board the conclusions of naval architects who have serious doubts about the structural design of the ships?
We try to understand the reasoning, but sadly we fail to come to a definite conclusion. Perhaps the adjudicators helping the Department of Transport had greater faith and greater understanding in traditional theories, rather than the radical theory which we had produced our conclusions on.
And that radical theory had come up with some alarming conclusions about traditional ship design. Ships, and in particular large ones like the Derbyshire, were always known to suffer from high stress in the middle. But research identified 2 further high-stress areas, one at the bow and one towards the stern just in front of the superstructure. It was this stern stress area that made the change to bulkhead 65 found by Peter Ridyard far more important than the builders could have known, and which would have caused cracks to radiate out from bulkhead 65 to the hull. This wasn't just theory. There was to be direct evidence from one Derbyshire sister, the Tyne Bridge, of severe cracking in the hull. This ship was so badly damaged, she was later scrapped.
Now, the implication of this in any of this analysis is that you will have stress concentrations. And if you have a fault, whether it's design or structural or any other form, then you will have a recipe for a failure.
But the Department of Transport had dismissed the research because Derbyshire sister ships like this one, now called the Nafseeker M, had had the girders strengthened after the first reports of cracking and had not had problems since, It also said another sister, the English bridge, had never had any serious problems at bulkhead 65. 8 months after the final Department of Transport report, the English bridge, now called the Kowloon Bridge, split apart at bulkhead 65. The ship had run aground on the Stag Rock in Bantry Bay off the coast of Ireland. On sinking, the stern split away from the hull at the precise point predicted by the research. Underwater, it became clear that the ship did have a history of cracking. The parallels with the Derbyshire were obvious. The ship was carrying heavy iron ore pellets, and she'd not been strengthened at bulkhead 65. In fact, to stop the deck splitting apart, 2 sections of girder were crudely welded across it. They can be seen in the centre here. Those girders and a section of deck were retrieved for examination by an expert on welding and brittle fractures. The girder on the bottom of the plate had a story to tell.
Well, the crack in the deck plate here is a brittle crack, and it's really snapped rather like a carrot, rather than stretching like chewing gum. It's a very fast fracture, and in practice could travel at several hundred meters a second, so it could go around the hull of the Derbyshire in, say, half a second. So it's virtually an instant crack.
It was enough for the Derbyshire families to win their fight for an official inquiry, giving them a focus for their campaign, alongside the memorial to the crew of the Derbyshire at the Seafarers' Church in Liverpool.
How are you? Come and have a look at the book.
They approached the inquiry with high hopes.
Well, it took us 7 years to get an inquiry. It took the Kowloon Bridge being lost. We probably made the mistake. We got a bit complacent. We sat back and we thought, yes, this is justice. We believe in it. Evidence, no problem. The truth's going to come out.
I thought that all the parties represented at the formal inquiry would want to know what happened, and they would all work to that aim.
The formal inquiry, so long after the Derbyshire had disappeared, was headed by Geoffrey Darling, QC. His team visited one of the then 4 surviving sister ships, where they examined parts of the ship, including some areas where the original steel had been removed and then replaced.
Yeah. What I think they might have done is a pad in the new part, a liner or a doubler in the new part.
We need to talk about this on our own.
Yeah. Okay.
But despite the fact that the inquiry had been triggered by the problems in the Kowloon Bridge, Mr. Darling declined to accept evidence about the sister ships and said the families and the union supporting them would have to bear the cost of introducing evidence about the section of deck plate from the Kowloon Bridge, something they were unable to do.
The Rec Commissioner took the decision that he did not want to hear that evidence because he said that he was conducting an inquiry into the loss of the Derbyshire and not an inquiry into problems on board the other ships. We were disappointed by that because we felt that the history of cracking on board the other ships and the fact that there was evidence that the Derbyshire herself had suffered cracking, all in the same area, that is in wear frame 65, was relevant to an investigation of the possible causes of the loss of the Derbyshire.
It had taken the family 7 years to obtain the inquiry. Many felt like giving up when the Rec Commissioner's conclusions put them back to square one.
The Derbyshire was probably overwhelmed by the forces of nature in Typhoon Orchid, possibly after getting beam on to wind and sea.
We felt humiliated. We were disgusted at it. We couldn't believe it. This is justice, what we believed in. And what went on at that inquiry?
That seemed to be the general feeling. It wasn't my fault. No, we did our best. And it's the best ship. We built the ship properly. You know, it was fine. And I'm thinking, so why did the Derbyshire sink?
We're getting requests from all over the world now, really, and we always tell them that, in fact, the book began, as you can see, with the Derbyshire.
With the family still reeling from the result, they could only contrast it with the official approach to investigating air or train accidents.
can't get at ships, can they? Because they're at sea and they go down and they disappear, and whereas trains or planes, the evidence is there, isn't it? What you can't see. This is what I think anyway. Out of sight, out of mind.
The first of the Derbyshire-class ships was the Furness Bridge. Her launch from the Haverton Hill Yard on Teesside in 1971 was meant to be a joyous occasion. But the Furness Bridge was damaged during launching and later needed extensive repairs to remedy that and other faults. It wasn't an auspicious start to the 5 ships that were to follow, bigger than anything before and at the leading edge of ship design. Shipbuilding has largely deserted this region. Haverton Hill Yard is closed now, like its parent company, Swan Hunter, further north on the Tyne. Amongst those who worked on the Liverpool Bridge, later the Derbyshire, was the man who was responsible for overseeing shipbuilders as a yard supervisor. He's still mystified as to what happened.
Everyone that worked in the shipyard was astounded. It was a good ship. You think, you don't know what to think. You know, you just think one of these massive waves that swamped it and taken it away. You don't know.
But Dispatches has uncovered compelling new evidence that misalignment of major parts of these ships was common. Terry Garbett was a steel fabricator on the first 2 vessels.
So how did they build the ships here?
Large sections, like I said, 1,800 tons, came out of the large sheds over there by the means of transporters, bogies, lifted up, large cranes again, and unfitted onto the keel on here. Sections which obviously would not fit were hammered into position by the use of, like I say, jacks again, large wedges, and it was a strenuous job for the lads on the sides of the ships, and their common nickname was the Hammer and Wedge Brigade. It was commonly called by the mates, obviously. It was a hard game they were on.
Forcing massive steel plates together to fit apparently wasn't an unusual shipyard practice to deal with misalignments. The massive shed where the sections of the 6 Derbyshire-class vessels began their lives is now largely deserted, apart from some steel fabrication work for the gas industry. But now a Lloyd's of London ship surveyor who worked on the first 2 of those sister ships has spoken for the first time publicly to Dispatches about what he saw. David Swift still has the notebook that formed the basis of the official journals he had to keep during the construction of the first of the class, the Furness Bridge, and the second ship, the Tyne Bridge.
I wouldn't have been happy to have sailed on any of them when they were carrying ore.
Why not?
Well, because of the very fact that these misalignments, as far as I was concerned, were that serious. And I would have been extremely worried that the potential for cracks developing, and they could have developed in all sorts of areas because of misalignment.
But it's his evidence about the design change to Bulkhead 65 which is vital. Mr. Swift says the change, which was first carried out on the Tyne Bridge, was not surveyed by him during construction.
I was absolutely dumbfounded to find that that alteration had taken place, mainly because you have to realise that we hadn't got so far as completely surveying that area of the ship. The survey work was always far too far behind, and although the ship had been launched, the survey work of that area had still not been completed when she was launched.
At the time of the formal inquiry into the Derbyshire's disappearance, Mr. Swift was still employed by Lloyd's. He wanted to give evidence and made that fact known.
I was prepared to make myself available, despite the fact that it could have put my job in jeopardy, because I wasn't sleeping, I was worrying, I felt so depressed that the true facts weren't coming out. And I approached a former Department of Transport senior surveyor, And the message I received back was that the legal representatives considered it was too late.
In any case, the formal inquiry decided to discount testimony about the sister ships, which meant that it could only reach one conclusion, that the weather was probably to blame. The clinching evidence would lie with the wreck of the Derbyshire. In the Japanese port of Yokohama, 14 years after the Derbyshire's loss, plans were taking shape to try to find the vessel. This complex and costly operation was funded not by the British government, but instead by the International Transport Workers' Federation, which was concerned about the 2,000 seamen who'd been lost on bulk carriers since the 70s. They were convinced the facts about the Derbyshire had not surfaced. Oceaneering Technologies, an underwater exploration company, intended to use a towed sonar system to scan the seabed. The budget and time were limited.
This is a 14-year-old mystery. The 44 seafarers lost their lives and their families back in the UK that have been waiting this long to get to the truth. There's no question.
The search was based on tantalising clues discovered after the Derbyshire went missing. Patches of oil seen floating on the sea.
How did it get here, but they didn't have the record? Well, think about it. You got the last position of the Derbyshire. You got an oil slick 20 miles away, and then you have another set of oil slicks 20 miles away. Well,
if these clues weren't adequate, the team knew that no one would try to find the Derbyshire again. But the crew were already monitoring bad weather in the search area. It would be a bitter irony if a typhoon stopped the discovery of the Derbyshire.
Weather conditions are crucial to any job like this, but particularly to a deep water job, because we're only talking about 8 to 10 days, and if you have a typhoon pass by your location, even if it's not a direct hit, you know, you're probably talking about 3 to 4 days being interrupted by having to move off the site, wait for the typhoon to pass, then move back.
The sonar, which would scan the seabed at a depth of 2 miles down, is prepared for launching. It will travel at the end of an armoured cable stretching 3 miles behind the ship. The search area has been drawn around 3 sightings of oil bubbling to the surface.
The 3 spots here, 3, 4 and 5, are about within a range of 7 nautical miles. And we're starting off the search in a few hours, concentrating on this particular area here.
As the search progresses, some sonar targets are noted.
okay, this is a replay of our first line, number 6. We got a couple of interesting things. First thing are these targets, 2 pretty clear ones, potentially another small one here. They're very square, they're reasonably hard. We feel they're man-made.
But as time runs out, a decision is taken to make a high-resolution pass by the sonar over the only target seen.
The thing is, there's a lot of cargo. You're talking about 160,000 tons of iron ore. Yeah. It's got to be somewhere.
That's all we've got. It's all we've got for £400,000. Come on, somebody stick their neck out and tell me it is the Derbyshire.
Was this the Derbyshire? The sea seems reluctant to reveal more. The towing cable snaps, dropping the sonar to the seabed.
What we're doing now is reconfiguring and readying the Magellan 725 ROV to make the dive to recover the Ocean Explorer sonar.
The Magellan ROV is a remote-controlled submarine with robot arms and cameras.
This could be rather advantageous. It's unfortunate that we have lost the towfish, and but from our point of view, they've agreed that we can use the ROV to identify the substantial area of wreckage that we located late last night.
Oh, that's sweet. Don't get any better than that.
Time for the search is running out, but the team recovers the sonar and the relief is palpable.
I am grateful to the Almighty, and I am very glad that we've got it back.
A lot of times we pull a lot of things out of the ocean, but it probably never means as much to you as when it belongs to you and it was something that got lost on your watch.
That night, with just a few hours left, the submarine returns to the bottom for a look at what the sonar had revealed. The cameras spot a shimmering seabed. It's made up of iron ore. The first clue, the Derbyshire's last cargo. The submarine begins to work its way through pieces of twisted and fractured metal.
Okay, we're on a large target. Wow. You can see all the structure.
A large piece of fabricated steel sheared through. It looks as though it's from the Derbyshire.
Think of identifying it. It's part of the bulkhead.
The operator is effectively flying the submarine through water 2.5 miles beneath him as it searches for more evidence.
That's broken there. There's a brittle fracture there.
There is a brittle fracture. There's no plate reduction, like no thickness reduction there.
Get going.
Doesn't this look like hull plating to you?
As the submarine propels itself up and over the wreckage, the remains of the bow are discovered.
Looks like a ladder there, doesn't it?
Apparently sheared off at one of the predicted weak points.
Whoever built this ship, can you tell that they built it now? Pulled the cable.
He didn't even start taking it yet.
The submarine hovers over the top of the remains of the bow.
Honest to hold? Yeah. Okay, Larry, hold that. It is a bit pointy, isn't it?
It's railing there as well.
Then slowly, it begins to drop down. The last 4 letters of the Derbyshire's name dimly visible in the darkness.
That's when Ron. Time 5:30.
It's just incredible, man. That's the Derbyshire. You can see them. I can see Shire. Only the Derby. The families are going to be so close.
The news is sent back to the families. At last they know where the ship lies.
I totally misjudged my feelings because I thought it would be one of elation. I was not expecting overwhelming grief. It took me back to 1980 again.
Everyone around you is jubilant that they found it. But anyone who lost someone on the Derbyshire, it was reliving it again. And I had to phone the families up and tell them. The reaction lived with me for the rest of my life, I think. And I had to say, well, they found it. You know, 3 or 4 seconds of complete silence. And then they break down. This went nearly every family. And what you've got to understand is, although it was 14 years, still part of us expected them to come back home. There was that little thing there, that we had that little bit of hope. And once they found the Derbyshire, I had to tell them families the hope had gone.
But if anything, the mystery over what had happened to the 44 people on the Derbyshire had deepened.
At the time, I was bewildered. And I've worked on ships that were purposely blown up. One that was torpedoed, one where the charter put TNT in the bow just to blow the ship apart. And they didn't even come close to comparing to the destruction that we saw with Derbyshire. Today, when you show it to experts, for the first time, you see the same sort of reaction. It's very difficult to understand that a structure that large, a ship, being so many pieces.
One theory, developed on the basis of both the research and the expedition's findings, suggests that within a short space of time, both the bow and stern came off the Derbyshire. As the ship sank, the pressure from rapidly increasing water depth caused a huge implosion of the air spaces in the middle section, ripping it apart and triggering the disintegration seen on the sonar images. And those sonar images have produced something that looks as though it could be the stern, separated from the hull at bulkhead 65.
We're very confident that that's a stern. And the crucial thing is that it appears to be fractured just forward of the superstructure, you know, right around the questionable frame 65.
Having considered the search evidence, the shipping consultant who advised the Derbyshire's owners, Bibby Line, at the formal inquiry, has spoken publicly for the first time.
It's very possible that the ship was lost due to massive structural collapse. This is certainly a leading contender, and it's consistent with the evidence brought back from the ITF expedition, both by the sonar data and the video data. It's now very necessary that a new expedition is mounted in order to, if possible, pinpoint the cause of the loss. We owe it as a debt of honor to those who died and as a debt of compassion to the families.
And on dispatches, the Shadow Shipping Minister is committing a future Labour government to reinvestigate the wreck because of the poor official performance so far.
What we're seeing in respect of this particular disaster, i.e., if you like, a reluctance on behalf of the government to take responsibility and really get to the bottom of what has happened. We're beginning to see that with other transport disasters as well. I'm talking about the Marchioness, I'm talking about Lockerbie. In respect to the Derbyshire, we want to have the expedition completed. We need to get all the information on video that we can possibly get now that the wreck has been located, and we want to set up an inquiry in order that once and for all we can get to the bottom of what happened.
The second investigation to the Derbyshire will advance considerably, significantly, our understanding of why the ship sank. And it is very likely, I think. I think the probabilities are more in the line of 75 to 80% that we will come back with evidence that can be used to determine exactly what caused it.
But there could be one serious political drawback to a government-sponsored investigation. In 1977, the year after the Derbyshire was built, Swan Hunter was nationalised, making the government liable for the ships that had been built at the yard. The year before the formal inquiry, the shipbuilders were privatised again. One of the conditions of the sale was that liability was retained by the state. It's thought the Derbyshire's insurers paid out today's equivalent of £25 million. The government may find the price of discovering the truth a high one.
They say there's nothing more dangerous than an angry sea. But there's nothing more dangerous than a transport department that goes around with their eyes shut, and there's nothing more dangerous than a government who turn their back on you. And that's what's happened to us. The government's turned their back on us, to put as much in our path as possible to stop it.
Someone is responsible for my husband's death, and I won't rest till I find out who's responsible.
On Monday, the Secretary of State for Transport, Dr. Brian Mulwiney, announced that Lord Donaldson had been appointed to investigate the loss of the Derbyshire. It's nearly 15 years since the ship sank. There's no commitment to a return to the wreck site. Officially, the Derbyshire is still recorded as lost through bad weather. 2.5 miles down, the evidence waits. On the bow, a plaque placed as a last mark of respect by the search team. The Derbyshire is there, ready to test the theories about why she sank. Total structural failure is the theory that the crew's families are also applying to the official attitude over 14 years to the mystery of the Derbyshire.
Good evening. The inquiry into the sinking of the Derbyshire, the biggest British ship ever lost at sea, is to be reopened 18 years after it went down in a typhoon off Japan. All on board, 42 crew and 2 wives were killed. Scientists have carried out a survey of the wreck 2.5 miles down on the seabed. They say there were no major structural faults, but that it was ill-prepared to take on the rigours of those seas. Our transport correspondent Simon Montague reports.
The stern of the Derbyshire and the story of how she sank can finally be told after 18 years at the bottom of the Pacific. The broken cargo hatch covers clues to her destruction in a typhoon 400 miles off Japan. The new evidence means that under law the inquiry must now reconvene.
I shall now order a formal investigation to be reopened so that it can come to the conclusion why she foundered. I know that will be widely welcomed by the families on the Merseyside and Tyneside, the seafaring community, and particularly their trade unions.
The decision follows a joint government and European Commission survey. From 200 hours of video and more than 130,000 photographs, investigators now know how the ship went down. In huge seas, this small forehatch, along with ventilation and air pipes, lost their covers, and the bow hold slowly filled. As the Derbyshire became nose-heavy, larger waves smashed in the forward cargo hatch covers, and thousands more tons of water flooded in. The build-up of water pressure led to a series of explosions and implosions, which ripped through the ship's holds. She sank in 2 minutes. After surveying 2,000 pieces of wreckage, the assessors have ruled out the long-held suspicion that a construction defect caused the Derbyshire to split in two. Instead, the loss of covers over openings in the bow meant she was ill-prepared to take on the rigours of typhoon seas.
There are no winners in this. There's a lesson for everybody in this thinking, and Derbyshire will carry a whole lot of changes forward, and the name will be carried forward in that way, and that's fitting for the families.
Representatives of the 44 people who died welcomed the inquiry's reopening. The chairman of the group lost his brother in the tragedy.
But the fact that they are saying that because the bow filled, the ship went down, that in itself proves to be a design fault. It's a known fact that a hole in the ship should be able to fill with water and that ship stay afloat.
The assessors make a series of safety recommendations. They include reviewing the limits on how low in the water ships should float, the possible strengthening of hatch covers, and the positioning of openings on the decks. It's been perhaps the greatest ever feat of underwater detective work, and for the families who've fought so long, action to improve safety would be a fitting tribute to those who died. Simon Montague, BBC News.